So, welcome everyone to the Geology of Surfing on this awesome Friday afternoon for most people, but depending on where you're calling in from, welcome from wherever you are in the world. This is the latest installment of our popular Geology of series. We started these webinars back in COVID as a way to keep people engaged during the pandemic, and we've continued them in a way to, foster professional networking and also educate both the members of our sponsored organizations as well as the general public on how geology can affect different aspects of our everyday lives. In the past, we've done some really good events on geology of beer, geology of wine, geology of pigments, geology of coffee. And in today's session, you'll learn about the relationship between geology and surfing. This event, I've got a connection to because I grew up near two of the surf spots that you're actually going to learn about today. I won't tell you which ones. And I always heard that, oh, there's a break here because of blah 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 feature or geologic aspect. And so, I'm excited to learn from our expert panelists on all of the technical and other details that we'll learn about today. In this webinar, you're going to be able to ask any questions to our panelists using the Q&A function of the Zoom interface. We also have a chat area, and that's a great place to socialize with people. And feel free to make comments about what you're hearing. If there's something really cool or something that relates to where you live or where you've been, feel free to share that. But if you do have any questions, we'll do your best to put those in the Q&A so we can get those answered at the end. We have three awesome sponsors for this event: the AAPG Women's Network, Midwest Geosciences Group, and AWG Lone Star. Special thanks to Midwest Geosciences for providing the commemorative surf wax, if anybody received any of these, and some really cool stickers. And let's see. I think that's it. Oh, and of course, we have an awesome committee of volunteers that helps put this together. You'll see them on and off throughout the webinar today, but it's Kat, Carla, Dan, Rebecca, and Chris, who unfortunately couldn't come today, but they've all put a lot of work into putting these events together. And off we go into the program. I'm going to hand it over to Kat.
Hello, hello. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our speakers for today. And shameless self-plug, I am calling you today from Lawrencetown Beach, which you might not know, but the east coast of Canada, quite far up north. We have some really great all-round surfing. So if you're ever up here and you want to check out our surf, we've got something for everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. Oh, I've got my little camera cover on there just in case. Here we are. This is Lawrencetown Beach behind me. Yeah, so I'm introducing here today. We have Amanda and John. I'm going to kick off here with Amanda. So Amanda has been surfing for a really long time. She started surfing in her late teens, and she has explored and surfed in various locales. She has here 10 countries. I'm sure it's going to be more than that pretty soon. Amanda currently lives in Houston, but she actually surfs there using the Gulf of Mexico as her home spot. So surfers always find a place to make surf work, that's for sure, with her husband and two sons. She also attended the University of Hawaii and the University of California, so she probably got bit by the bug there and got pretty excited about it. And she got a Bachelor of Geological Sciences in 1996. Then she went to landlocked Colorado, got another degree from the Colorado State University, but has since 2000 been working in the energy industry. So shows you that even if you grow up in the mountains of Oregon, you can become very passionate about the ocean and surfing. So Amanda, we're really happy to have you here today. And then we have John Warrick. So John himself grew up in real surfing capital itself, Southern California, rode his bike to the ocean to swim, body surf, and all that good stuff. He's got a lot of family. It seems like it's in his blood to surf. So he's been doing this for a really long time, but became involved in academics and coastal zone science. So he's got degrees from California. I think that's Polytechnic, says Cal Poly, but I assume California Polytechnic. St. Louis, Obstaco, mispronouncing that probably, and the University of Wisconsin at Madison. and the University of California at St. Barbara. So all really great spots. And for the last 23 years, he has Dr. Warrick, so PhD, has been working at the USGS, Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center in Santa Cruz, California. So as a USGS scientist, John, I should say, has published dozens of peer-reviewed articles on coastal processes and landforms. And there's a really great video that the USGS has out, which is called The Science of Surfing. So if you're looking for even more content after this webinar, highly suggest Googling that. But yeah, huge welcome to Amanda and John. Thanks for being here today. We've got great geology, we've got great coastal science, and together we're going to have a really fantastic discussion. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, so welcome. I am really excited to be here. This is definitely the highlight of my week, and this is something for me that I'm really passionate about, something I love and I enjoy deeply, and it's been a real pleasure to get to put this together with the organizing committee and with Jonathan. So glad to be here. This is the agenda we were looking to cover today, and we wanted to talk about how does wind, waves, geology, and subsequent topography all sum up to give us the gift of surfing. We'll talk about some specific fun surf spots, and then finally we'll discuss a bit about how you can get involved if you're so inclined after watching this, or maybe you're already a surfer and just want to talk a little bit more. And then I think we've got some fun Q&A at the end, because I already saw some names in the attendee list of folks that I know surf, who I have served with, and have some probably great stories to tell. All right. Well, let's start with some generalities and some beautiful images. And these are all courtesy of I think Jonathan and the internet. But waves they're cool and fun. There's a 2003 film, and it was called Step into Liquid, for anyone who may have seen it. And it's a seminal film. And there's a surf personality in there called Sam George. And he's pontificating on what it is about waves and how it's so unique among sports, in that you can just go watch the waves, and there's no other sport where anyone wants to just go sit and see the playing field, right? You don't go watch a tennis court, you don't go look at a football field. But waves are so different in that they're so dynamic and they're beautiful, and even if you're not surfing on them, they're fascinating to be part of and watch. So let's start with that. And then finally, waves come in different shapes and sizes. Why is that? Each one's totally unique. They're like snowflakes. No two waves are ever going to be the same. They're going to come in totally different shapes and sizes. And there's things that drive that. And you can see from these images that, these are all pictures of waves, but you can see how different all of these waves are. And so waves come in many shapes and sizes because they're the result of interactions between the offshore wave field, which we're going to discuss what forms that, and then the offshore topography, which we're going to discuss what tends to influence that. And these are some beautiful images of just open ocean, the wave field, some bathymetric maps, which is seafloor elevation. Jonathan's going to speak to these a little bit. And so ultimately, what drives the wave field and the topography that gives us the conditions for surfing is where the sciences of oceanography, meteorology, geology, and geomorphology intersect. And any serious surfer will generally become a hack in all of these areas in his or her quest for surf. So you will know something about wind, you will know a little bit about the sea bottom, you will have a feel for how does your spot work on any given tide. So we call ourselves experts, but you end up being a hack in a number of things. And these are some really cool images. You can see folks out looking at the reef, the buoys, some beautiful maps showing submarine canyons, which us as geologists we're really familiar with, right? Deep water geology and submarine canyon, study has been meat and potatoes for probably most of our careers. So it's a really interesting confluence of all of these sciences. Okay. So I think at this point we have a few questions we want to ask.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm going to go for those who are joining later, maybe. So there's an interactive component to this. If you go to menti.com and enter this code, or you scan this QR code, or there's a link in the chat that Carla, I think you just posted again, you can answer a few more questions. And I'm actually going to shift over to Menti real quick and just let's look at present. There we go. So this is exciting, all the different places people are joining from. Oh, wow, we have people from Rio de Janeiro, Lanzarote. Wow, some some interesting places that we don't always get people from. So that's awesome. Welcome everyone. And let's see. Oh, wow, we have a nice distribution. Quite a lot of people who've never surfed and a few people who've surfed a few times and everyone else in between. You even have some experienced people. This is awesome. A good distribution of folks. Looks like more are streaming in. Um, let's see. I think this is a strong California, Hawaii, and Australia bias, but lots of representation from everywhere else. All right. So this is going into this, what people think are important. I I think we're going to talk about most of these. I don't know about the SpaceX Starships. I don't know how that one's related, but I think a lot of these we're going to cover. So cool. All right, so those are the first four, and I'm just going to preview into the next two because um, we'll hear about these. Oh, I've never surfed. Recognized trestle. Oh, the not too crowded ones. Those are always the best ones to find. Oh, Halama has some beautiful Dolomites in Halama Beach that I've been to. Wow, cool.
Pembrokeshire.
Pembrokeshire. Wow,
Sounds
that's cool.
cold.
Yeah, very cool. C Street. Yeah, Montauk. Wow, East Coast in here too. Awesome. Great. Oh, Bali. That's nice. Okay, I think we're going to learn about some of these as well. And then let's see. Oh, wow. Yeah, a lot of people have heard of Pipeline, and I'm wearing my Mavericks shirt today, and Chopu, and awesome. Cool. Well, great. That's great. We have another little pause break, and we'll come back to some more questions here later. So let's go back to our slides. And I wanted to, while you're still working on Menti, feel free to look through that. Just wanted to call your attention to one of our sponsoring organizations, the AAPG Women's Network. We are involved in, we're one of the organizations that helps put these webinars together. If you're not a member and would like to be, you can follow the link on this page, or it's in the chat as well. And that's a great place to join. Even if you're, well, if you are or are not an AAPG member, you can still click on that link and sign up, and that'll get you on our mailing list for future events. Also to note is all those awesome events that I was referring to earlier. These are all recorded and put on our YouTube channel, including this one as well, which will be available later on our YouTube channel. And the link is in the chat for the location for our YouTube channel where you can find the previous recording. So if you want to go back and learn about beer and how geology influences that, or pigments and paints, you can find them there. I see some hands, a couple of hands have been raised. If you have any questions or concerns, just go ahead and put them in the chat, either just to the panelists or just to everyone, and we'll try to get them addressed there. All right. Now, I'm going to give control to John. Go ahead. Let me see.
Perfect. Thank you.
Remote.
Oh, well, that's really interesting to see where people are from and where they've surfed in your experiences. And as Amanda told us, we become hacks at a lot of these things. That was brilliant, Amanda. Fantastic. And so I have had the joy of being able to study a lot of the things that I'll share here scientifically, but I also do it sort of day by day when I'm in the water and trying to understand why things are happening the way they are, why waves are coming from a certain place or a certain.
Hey, John, can you speak a little bit closer to your mic? I can't hear it as well, and I see somebody
Absolutely,
mentioning it.
you got
Great.
it. Yeah, apologize.
No
So
worries. That's
I
better.
wanted to start off by talking a little bit about waves, because with surfing, we're looking at, as Amanda talked about, the combination of the wave field with the what's on the seafloor, and the combination makes for the waves that we surf. And so, just on a sort of real basic level, wave formation, we'll cover that quickly. And the first element to waves is that the waves are generated by the winds over the ocean. And so when we think about how waves are generated and why they may differ at different times, there's sort of three factors we think about. The first is the wind speed. How strong are the winds? And in general, the stronger the winds, you can see in that picture in the middle, there's some pretty high seas. It's probably during a storm. And when we get higher and higher winds, and we'll talk about hurricanes in a little bit, we see larger and larger waves. Another thing is
Hey, John, sorry, I saw two more points that
yeah.
people can't hear quite as well.
Oh shoot.
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Maybe just crank up
Okay.
your volume. Sorry.
I don't.
Yeah, I also hear fine, so I would encourage everybody to make sure your speakers are up as loud as you can have them.
I've
Oh,
never.
that's great. That's perfect.
Yeah, I can. Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's just getting closer to the
Yeah.
mic because it just comes in and out.
Lean in.
Yeah,
Lean
exactly.
in.
Lean in. Right
I
on.
can hear you perfect now, so go for it.
Very good. Okay.
Sorry
Very
to
good.
interrupt.
Apologize for everybody. So with waves, we think about the wind, and wind it's wind speed. A term we call fetch, and fetch is basically how long of a distance the wind will blow over. And with bigger storms that cover larger parts of the ocean, we generally see larger waves. And the last factor is time. The longer the wind will blow over a piece of ocean, generally the bigger the waves will arise. So those are the three main factors in terms of generating waves. And so one of the things that a lot of us surfers hack out on is weather. We're always looking at weather maps and trying to figure out what's going on the ocean. And oh, look at that storm out there. And wow, that's coming from the right direction. And ooh, that might be something on Thursday that we're going to see, or et cetera. One of the really neat things about that, to me, is that because the ocean is so large, and we often have multiple storms and different wind fields over the ocean at the same time, waves can come from different directions, and so it's often the additive sort of nature of waves coming in from one direction and maybe a smaller wave coming from another direction because there are storms in one area of the ocean and minor winds in another area. And that's kind of shown there in that bottom plot. That bottom plot shows the effects of waves on the top plot coming in from a general direction. And as you move down, you can see how the waves kind of get crossed up. And that can be a good thing for certain surf breaks, and that can be a bad thing for certain surf breaks. It really depends on the surf break. And we can talk about that a little bit later. Let's see if I can change slides. I might need your help. There you go. Thank you. So another important part of the wave field is how that wave field interacts with the continental shelf. And so once waves come into those shallower waters, if they're generated out in the deep sea or across the ocean, the waves, we think of the waves as feeling the bottom. And what that means is the orbital velocities start rubbing against the seafloor. And what that does is it induces some friction. And one of the coolest things about that is it causes refraction. And so refraction, you may think of refraction in waves by light passing through the water surface. And if you fish, you may see like that light, those light waves bend. And so You have to, things underwater look bigger or look different because of that refraction. Well, the same kind of thing happens as ocean waves come across the continental shelf. As they feel the bottom, they are bent and sort of like in that figure shown on the top, waves converge towards headlands. And this is something that's really important in terms of where waves will be sort of focused and where we see the biggest waves. And they're generally around these points. Most importantly, they're around where points are sort of sticking out in the bathymetry off on the continental shelf. And so here's I've shown a couple of examples of areas where like Piahi and Maui, and then in Santa Cruz here at Pleasure Point and at Steamer Lane, we have points that stick out into the ocean, and waves refract around that, and more energy is pushed towards those points. And I'm going to need this. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so another really important thing is another type of a wave, and that is the tide. And tides differ around the world. Tides are formed because of the gravitational forces of the moon and the sun. If you look at tides on the globe, there are all these wonderful patterns. You could probably find movies of this on YouTube, or maybe you were shown this in some of your oceanography classes, but there are these waves of water that flow around the ocean basins. And what that results in is, times when the tides are high and times when they are low. And that can influence surf breaks quite a bit. In general, some of the sandier places, where we have sandbars, in general, at high tide and low tide, they're often not as good because the waves are breaking too soft when the tide is high, and maybe too rigorously when the tide is low in general. And I'll show you some examples of that in a second. And then for rocky reef breaks or coral reef breaks, it really depends on the reef which tide would make it best. Surfers often talk a lot about when the tide is rising, the waves fill in, you get a tidal push. This can be measured in some places, but not all. And what that means is that it seems like waves get bigger as the tide is coming in. And I could take you to some places where that's really dramatic, and like in some inlets up in Canada and in sort of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, that I've seen that effect, and it's very measurable. In other places, it's not so measurable. So, but it's an interesting factor that can happen. One other really cool thing about tides, and if you go to the next slide, is we have these really neat things called tidal bores. And tidal bores occur across river mouths. Typically, they're broad, shallow river mouths that constrain yes, really cool. Yes, absolutely, I agree. And these tidal bores occur when the tide is coming up. And probably the most famous is in the Amazon River, and that's shown in that lower right picture. But these things are completely surfable, and some people, there's some great video of this. They can be extremely high performance waves, or they can be really fun waves like what you see there on the Amazon. You can ride these waves anywhere from a few minutes to tens of minutes to hours. People spend a day following these up rivers in boats or in trucks. They're really fantastic. I have never surfed a tidal bore. I don't know, Amanda, have you?
I have never surfed a tidal bore.
I think Amanda and I think that's our first surf trip together, is we got to figure out a place to go to, because I need to surf one of these. They're just really neat phenomena. And you basically wait all day for the bore to come, and then when it comes, you get your chance. And so it's another really interesting thing that happens in river mouths. Okay, next. So when it gets down to wave breaking, if waves have now passed, they've been generated out at sea, they come across the continental shelf, and then they come up to the beach. The way that they break is purely a function of the wave itself and then the bathymetry, the underwater topography. And there's sort of a general rule in that the way that it breaks is a function of how steep that bathymetry is. And so on a very shallow sloped area, we think of scientifically, we call that a spilling wave. A surfer may call it mushy. It doesn't, there's really no tube. It's a really great place to learn how to surf. It's a fairly gentle wave, and easy to get around and get through. There's some examples like Cowles here in Santa Cruz, San Onofre down in Southern California. There's a lot of waves like this. Generally, there's sandbars that do this. Again, it's a very flat slope beach. And as you get into steeper slopes, the wave will overtop more quickly. And we call that in science a plunging wave. Surfers will call it, barreling, tubing, waves with a good pocket. Like this thing behind me, that's a wave that's breaking here just up the coast in Santa Cruz. And then when that bottom slope gets really steep, we have what we call a collapsing wave, or something that's really heavy, a death pit, something really, really, right? And there's plenty of examples of this. The Wedge is one in Newport Beach. Chapu in Tahiti is something that we'll talk about in a bit. There's a lot of interest in these waves these days. There's a lot of folks who go after these waves exclusively, and it's not something that I'm into. They're extremely dangerous, but thrill of a lifetime kind of a place. Okay. And again, that's all based upon how that, in general, that bottom slope is right there at the beach. And then the other factor for sort of waves is how that varies across the shore or the beach setting. And so we have all kinds of different settings, and we're going to get into some examples here in a second. And those influence how the waves may break, and how long of a wave you may get. And I'll take the middle example there. There's a point you can see that there's that's Rincon Point in California, and it sticks out to sea. And you can see how the waves and the white water of those waves break all the way along that point. And you can get rides all the way down that point. I've gotten a few from the very top all the way to the highway, and I could barely stand on my board at the end. My legs were so exhausted. And that's because, and it's a fairly nice wave with a good pocket and a little bit of a tube. And that's because it has a fairly steep beach slope, but that occurs around this curve. And that curve allows that wave to have what we call a face, an open area of that blue water that you can surf in that pocket and just, have fun. So there's a whole diversity of these types of settings. Sandy beaches are a really neat one, primarily because they change all the time. Sandy beaches have these bars, and they're moving and evolving with the waves. And so you can have a big storm, which causes new bars, and that may change those slopes and those patterns. And then a month later can be completely different. So there's all kinds of neat stuff going on out there. And it's all related to the wave field, and then how that wave field interacts with the underlying geology and geomorphology. Okay, let's go to the next one. And I'll pass it to Amanda.
Yeah, so hand it back. All right, well, so Jonathan's been talking about the slopes and the shapes of the bathymetry. And so we're going to go back to, I think for when I look at the folks in the call, this is Geology 101, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about how the seafloor bathymetry is then tied to geology and geological processes, both at the large scale and at the small scale. So let's, for the sake of the discussion, we're going to break the surf spots into the 3 plate tectonic domains in which they exist, right? So those that occur at active margins, which, we can see a visual of this in the center. Those that occur at passive margins, picture of this to the left, and then at hot spots or mantle plumes. So those that occur at active margins, which we can see here in the center, is where one plate's being subducted beneath another plate, and these margins tend to have really steep continental slopes. They have narrow continental shelves, and they have a limited accumulation of sediment just due to the high energy in the tectonics. And some of these interesting features we're going to talk about can get really close up to the shoreline and influence how the waves are actually breaking, or the seafloor bathymetry. In the contrast, passive Martians, illustrated here on the left, generally have shallower slopes. They have wide, flat continental shelves, and they have much more sediment accumulation, right? These are places where we're not cramming one plate into another. We're generally pulling away, and there's the tectonism is much different, and so these margins tend to be much more sediment dominated. And then lastly, volcanic hotspots, which aren't associated with constructive or destructive margins. Basically, they're associated with where there's a hot plume of mantle material that's coming up, and it creates a volcano high above the seafloor. And this topography, along with other processes like reef building, basically lead to a feature out in the ocean that can interact with the wave field to create surf. And so in the general sense, that's where most of these surf spots that we're talking about are going to lie. Okay, so let's look at this with a little bit more detail. So we're going to look at some examples. If we look at the image to the left, this is a bathymetric map, which is essentially a depth from dry land down into the submarine. So it's a depth map of the active continental margin near Monterey, California. So the browns that you see, the dark browns, and I'm pointing with the pointer, these are dry land. The orange is submerged continental shelf. And then the blues, which are increasing depth down the slope, you can see I'm getting from lighter to darker. And you can see how narrow the shelf is, right? This orange is quite narrow. You can see really cool, interesting geological feature of this is the Monterey Channel, and it's coming up all the way almost to the dry land, cutting into that shelf, or into that continental shelf. That's a super cool feature, and again, I said I think most of us bread and butter is submarine geology, deep water geology. And in these active settings, the geological features that are driving a lot of the local bathymetry that influences the waves are things like wave cut platforms. Jonathan's going to show an example of that with one of his case studies. These proximal submarine canyons, which can influence how the waves are being focused. Delta mouths, like areas where sediments are coming out and they can, cause a protuberance out into the, along the shoreline. They can influence the waves. They provide sediments. They can move down the beach line, and other, local protuberances that impact waves. Jonathan was showing, that example there of Rincon, and I think we talked that, if I'm right, Jonathan, they believe that Rincon is actually a big slump feature that's essentially sticking out along the coastline. Or alternately, there's a spot down in Nicaragua that I've been to a number of times called Sunzal that I believe it's a protuberance tied to a lava flow. So anything that's basically sticking out and out of the coastline, causing the waves to move around it, is going to have an impact in these kinds of settings. In the contrast, in the middle here, we're going to look at, I don't know if it's just for me, but does this map look kind of blurry for everyone? I guess it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, it's blurry, but you can get the gist of it. This is a bathymetric map of the Gulf of Mexico. So for those of us energy industry geologists, this is a pretty hot area in most people's careers. And what you can see is how different this looks from the active margin, right? So this up here is the continental shelf. It's very broad. It's very shallow. You can see a submarine canyon here. It doesn't get near the land. there's a lot more sediment out here along this shelf. This is the continental slope. You start to see some interesting features, and these are, associated with salt and whatnot. And then here's the very deep part of the Gulf of Mexico. But it's a very different environment. And in this setting, the waves are largely influenced by features tied to the sediment input, and they're tied to the sediment, how it's then being moved along the shoreline. So, for example, delta mouths and sandbars are things that may be influencing the waves in this kind of a setting. And then lastly, on the right, what you can see here is the same bathymetric map of, this is the Hawaiian Islands. And you can see where these features just very abruptly rise right out of the seafloor. And as this tectonic plate was moving over the hotspot, these volcanoes are popping up, older to younger as they, form, and then the hotspot, is fixed and the plate moves over and the next volcano forms. But essentially, these very high relief features that are, popping up on the seafloor, along with other associated processes like reef building in these, topographic highs where you have shallow warm water, and reefs can grow and create additional local bathymetry. Those are the kinds of things that are going to be driving the waves in a hotspot environment. And, a lot of the world-class waves we're looking at are indeed in hotspot environments, which is interesting. And then lastly, human modifications, right? There's nature, and then there's us. And this also can have an impact on how the waves are. So how the sediments distributed along the shoreline is influenced by jetties. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in my case example here in Texas. Seawalls, dredging. These glorious pictures are a spot in California that's quite famous and quite heavy, called the Wedge. I have no experience. I'm an utter coward. I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, but I think I think Jonathan does. So, Jonathan, maybe you can speak to the Wedge a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I used to body surf the Wedge when it was small, and I grew up near the Wedge. These heavy days were for other folks completely. But one of the interesting thing about the Wedge is that it's the fact that the wave is there is purely a function of another process that I didn't talk about, and that's reflection. And so here, during big south swells that are generated either by hurricanes off Baja California or big storms in the southern ocean, those waves come in, and you can sort of see it there, how the wave comes and it actually is running along that long jetty. And as it does that, yes, it actually reflects, energy reflects off of that. And so the next wave that comes through gets the benefits of both bits of energy. And so the energy combines together. And so you can kind of see that little funny wave on the inside. Yes, right there. That's one of those reflected waves. And so this whole surf break, which is, you can see some really amazing video on YouTube if you just, type in wedge surfing or something. And it's one of these really steep beaches. It can be very dangerous, but it really is only formed because of the jetty there. That jetty makes that reflection, causing this wave. And just one example of how human modifications to the coast can change the way the waves break. Here, it's one that sort of people revere. Other places it may ruin a surf break. So there's lots of examples of those. We won't go into all of them, but yeah, the Wedge down in Newport Beach.
Okay. Are we going to dive into case studies?
Yeah, do we have other Mentimeter or no? We have, yeah,
okay. Well, all right. So at this point, we thought, it would be really interesting to then talk about a few spots in specific. And some of these you're probably familiar with. You may have seen them. Some of them maybe not. They're all different. We broke it into, we're going to look at, well, what's the geological setting? What are the wave dynamics, the kind of things that Jonathan's been talking about? And then, what sort of tides and winds makes these spots work? And those are the things that you want to know if you were ever looking to go surf a spot like this. So who watched the Olympics this year? I'm going to assume, yeah, a lot of people watch the Olympics. Well, right, surfing is new to the Olympics. I don't know how many years it's been in there, but not that long. And this year, the Olympic surf competition was held at a spot called Chapu in French Polynesia. And I think I've pronounced it right. The pronunciation tends to have changed over time. But this is a very, very, very special wave. It is big. It's powerful. It's a spot only for pros, and very good pros at that. The spot is in the background. It's a volcanic hotspot. Okay, so these are mantle plumes where a big topographic feature has developed due to the underlying geological processes, and then it has coral reef around it. So reefs that have grown up off of this topographic high, warm water, clean water. This is actually what it's called, a fringing reef, which we'll have a picture of that in the next slide. But the spot's really unique in that the bottom goes from more than 1,000 feet deep, just a third of a mile offshore, to more than a mile deep, just 3 miles offshore. So it's a very steep slope. And as a result, the swells essentially don't feel the ocean floor or start getting, feeling the ocean floor, feeling that energy, wanting to break until they get very, very close to the shore. They're about a half a mile from the shore, is when the real open energy starts to march into Tiapu. And when these inbound swells start to converge towards the stretch of the coast, it provides even more focus of the energy onto this particular break. So the swell comes in, it rises quickly from depths. It's really amplified at the edge of the shelf. And at about 150-foot water depth in this slope, there's nearly what they call a 1-to-1 ratio on the slope in terms of, the distance of horizontal distance that you cover versus the vertical distance that you rise is incredibly steep. And then once you get into about the 20-foot depth zone in the surf, the slope relaxes just a tiny bit to about 1 to 3, allowing the wave to actually be rideable. Otherwise, this thing would just completely collapse in on itself. It would be darn near unrideable. And if you look at the spot, you can see some of these images here, right? If you can see it with my cursor, this is a cartoon of how the swell is coming in. It hits this very, very steep slope, and then it jumps up and it's breaking to the point where you can see it's incredibly top heavy. Look at these visuals here. Like most of the waves that I ride, it's much thicker down here than it is up here, and that's what makes this wave just so powerful and so unique is that steep slope, and it's just on the precipice of not being ridden. The spot works on a long to mid-period swell. It forms very rapidly, as we just talked about, fast and powerful. Because of the way it's oriented, it likes southwest winds coming in, and apparently, I haven't surfed there, but what I read is it's fairly tide agnostic. Some spots are very much driven by, what the tide's doing and how good it is, but this spot apparently tends to be not very much driven by the tides. So let's show another picture of this spot here. Hey, Stefano, it is not wanting to progress for me. There it goes. So this is a beautiful image of Chapu, courtesy of Jonathan. And then a nice little cartoon of, what these hot spots can look like, and then reefs that grow up around them, and fringing reefs where it's essentially there's the reef is very much associated with the island feature, and barrier reefs where there's a low in between, and then atolls where really all you're seeing is the reef. You're not really seeing the topographic feature in between. But what you can see here is this is Tahiti, and I think right here is the Chapu break. This is a cut in the reef, which reefs also, storm events or whatnot, they can make deep channels into the reef, which basically the break will essentially die into that deeper channel, right? The energy, it can't feel the bottom, and that makes it such that you can paddle out in that, boats can park in that without getting drilled. And this is just a really beautiful, unique spot, and very, very powerful. I mean, this isn't a spot that you would want to go, obviously, as a beginner. I believe, sadly, but everything comes with its risk. Like, this spot has literally removed professional surfers' heads from their necks. It is for the professional and for the professional with a lot of courage. So yes, this is Chiapu for those who saw the Olympics.
Hey, Amanda and John, before we go on, just wanted to remind people, if you have any questions along the way, if you see something and you're inspired by a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. We'll have a session to answer them at the end, but we're happy to collect them as we go. So while you see something and have a fresh
yes.
question, put it in there.
I saw somebody mentioning Caroline Marks. So she
Yeah!
is from Florida. She's very young as well. She's incredibly accomplished for her age. But we had a young American woman who actually won the Olympics.
Yeah.
She's phenomenal.
She's fantastic. She's one of my heroes. Love Caroline Marks. I saw that too, and I was like, yeah. Of course, Katie Simmers and all there's some amazing surfers these days. So I'll take you to a whole nother setting. We're going to go to an active margin setting, Mavericks. So Mavericks is just up the coast from me, near Half Moon Bay. And Mavericks is well known as one of the big wave spots of the world. It's a training ground for many big wave surfers. People fly around the world here when the big winter swells come for conditions like you see in those photos. Generally, it's the wave. The best waves are in the wintertime when these long, open, big Pacific Northwest swells come in from the Northern Pacific. These are large low pressure systems that form in the Northern Pacific, blow a lot of wind over a lot of ocean and create waves that are just incredible. When you look at the bathymetry there in the lower panel, so that's another bathymetric map that was put together, about almost 2 decades ago now, and showing water depth shallower in the red and deeper as you go down into the blue colors. What you can see there is the underlying geology. And so that is what we call the Parissima Formation. It's about 2 to 8 million years old. It's marine sedimentary rocks, siltstones, some sandstones, a little bit of conglomerate here. And what's interesting is you can see the folds in it, and you can see how there's some areas stick up higher than others. And that's because of the differential weathering that's occurred there. And so the low spots, right in there, those low and high spots, the high spots are the more resistant layers, and the low spots are the less resistant layers. And so you can see that really well on the north side. Where the Mavericks Reef is, you can see how it kind of uniquely just juts out to sea. And if you remember earlier, we were talking about refraction, bending waves into points. And so this is one of those places where that Mavericks Reef offshore sticks out so far that waves are bent in and into the shallow areas and become this massive wall of water. Just amazing. Again, another place where you can just, YouTube Mavericks surf and you'll be blown away. So why did this occur? Well, let's go to the next slide. You might have seen there the words wave cut platform. Well, this is part of the wave cut platforms that are forming currently along the California coast and in many coasts around the world. Wave cut platforms are commonly found in active margins. There's certainly what has formed over time marine terraces. And so here in Santa Cruz, we have marine terraces. We see them down in Palos Verdes and all over the world where we have a slowly uplifting landscape and the sea cutting these notches at high stands. And so we're at a high stand in the sea levels right now. And so waves are actively cutting at the geologic materials of our coast and leaving that wave cut platform. So in that lower figure, you can see that broad area called the wave cut platform below what's called the wave attack zone. And so at these high sea level states, we see the waves cutting at the cliffs, but leaving behind these platforms. And those platforms, the shape of them will be a function of what was there before, right? So at Mavericks, we had this Parissima formation, and it had this these interesting characteristics to it, and it left that reef. And so that's all, again, part of that process of those wave cut platforms. And sort of, we got lucky at Mavericks, I guess, right? That it kind of formed this little point in that wave cut platform.
Well, John, real quick, I want to add one thing, just because this spot is close to my heart. I did my thesis area just north of here off this map, but there's a splay of the San Gregorio Fault, the Seal Cove splay, that comes on shore and forms this pressure ridge, and then it comes back offshore here. And so this is all uplifted and folded because you've got a fault coming into the channel, or coming into Half Moon Bay, and forming this pressure ridge and forming all this folding. So I had to throw my fault in there. Just
absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. You're not at fault for sharing your faults. Okay, this one's Amanda.
Yeah. This is my current hometown break. So I live in Houston, and you can go over to Galveston in one direction, it takes about an hour, or you can go down to a spot called Surfside, which is about an hour in the other direction, to the southeast. And Surfside actually reminds me, that's our local home break, but it's a lot like what I imagine LA was in the 1930s. If I were alive in LA in the 1930s, just a real beautiful little, small town, everything on stilts kind of place. But right, we're in the Gulf of Mexico, so we're in a passive margin setting, Barrier Island. Both spots are located on the seaward side of a large barrier island, right? And they're generally associated with the accumulation of sediments near either the Galveston Pier or the Surfside Jetty. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The surf dynamics in these spots are controlled by essentially the wind direction and the wave energy, and the associated longshore drift of sediments. The wind pattern in the Gulf of Mexico is what we, in surfers' terms, when I said hack, I don't know what, actual meteorologists call it, but we call it wind swell. And what it means is it doesn't blow over a long distance normally, and it doesn't blow very long. So generally the surf associated with that doesn't tend to be well organized. It picks up real quick, it can drop real quick, but what we generally get is what we call wind swell. So not long, like these big, beautiful, long, swells like what Jonathan was talking about that you get in open ocean, right? The Gulf of Mexico is a restricted body of water. We do, however, get some nice, more long period swells. That's associated generally with tropical storms or hurricanes. I'll talk about that in a minute. That's not our usual state of being. That's pretty much during the hurricane season. And in the summer, the winds tend to come from the southeast, which the way the longshore drift works is the way that the wind is blowing against the coastline. If it's blowing from the northeast, the sediments are going to be moving. If you look at the images, can you got my little laser pointer, and I'm pointing to some images here, some diagrams of how the longshore drift works, right? So if the wind is blowing from, let's say this is Barrier Island of Galveston, from the northeast, it's going to be basically resulting in sediments moving along the shoreline towards the south. Whereas if it's blowing from the southeast, which is what we get a lot in the summer, they tend to be moving more towards the northish. And so where you have these jetties, which is what generally Surfside is, it's a big jetty, and then we have piers and a jetty down in Galveston, the sediments then tend to interact with these features, and we get more sand on one side or the other of these features based on whichever way the longshore drift is going at that time. And these sandbars is what essentially is giving us the surf in Galveston. And so, these features they're crumbly, the way Jonathan described it, limited fetch, slow, crumbly, forgiving for the most part. But they're also constantly changing, right? Any given day they're changing. You may have, some longer periods of the season where you're like, oh, this area, this tends to be a good spot. The sandbars are hanging in here, but one big storm and things can change quite a bit. And I've been surfing there off and on now for 20 some odd years, and it has changed a lot. And there can be some fundamental changes when we get these big hurricanes that come in and fundamentally change the background there. Um, so both Surfside and Galveston, they tend to favor these, more summerly, these southeast winds. And in my experience, I will say it's tide neutral. It's, it is what it is, regardless of the tide. um, and then just some, images of this is Surfside down here. I snapped this off of a decent day we had not too long ago. And then this is the pier down in Galveston. And, Jonathan and I were having an interesting conversation here about these hurricane swells that for us as surfers can bring amazing, conditions, can also be a real double-edged sword. In the summer, we these big hurricanes, and we just had one recently. It was in the news, right? Hurricane Helena. And these generate the longer period swells that can create great surf. But the surfability is also tied to where your particular spot is relative to the storm. Hurricanes in the Gulf rotate counterclockwise, and the storm they're broken into what we call the dirty side of the storm and the clean side of the storm. On the dirty side, the wind is blowing from the ocean to the land. We call this onshore, and it's also moving in the direction of the storm. So, like in this case, if this is Helena, right, this would be the dirty side of the storm. The storm is moving in this direction, and the winds are rotating in this direction. So this wind is blowing onshore onto land. It's coming with a big storm surge, and it's also making the swell really just chaotic and disorganized. Now, on what we would call the clean side of the storm, which is where we were sitting in Houston during this storm, what you get is these offshore winds, due to the rotation that are in generally, they tend to clean up the waves and stand them up a little bit. And you're also not getting that big storm surge that can be so destructive. Um, and so you can see from the pictures that this is actually from folks that were surfing down in South Padre Island during Hurricane Helena. It's beautiful. If you didn't know better, I could tell you this was Hawaii, right? It's beautiful, clear water. It's barreling waves. It's gorgeous. But on that other side of the coin, this hurricane was absolutely, devastating for the folks who were on the dirty side and got hit by it. And so, it's an interesting, whenever I'm out surfing in the storm like that, I'm so grateful for the experience and the waves, but I'm also very cognizant of, other people are really being very, negatively and dramatically impacted by it. So just something to, have in your mind about the things that are giving us surf can also be, very destructive on the other side of the coin. Okay. So I'll hand over to Jonathan to talk to us about Blackster Nazar.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that, Amanda. Because winds generate waves, those are the same winds that are in some of these nasty storms that can cause all kinds of destruction. So we're we always are tapped into those cycles. So changing gears a little bit, Amanda brought up submarine canyons earlier, and I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about some of the breaks that occur around submarine canyons. And so in active margins, we see some of these canyons going all the way up near the beach. Two good examples of that in terms of surfing are Blacks down in San Diego. That's right where Scripps is, just on the north side of Scripps, right? Where I hear there's some really nice turbidites and things to look at there. And Nazaré in Portugal, which is this amazing big wave spot, which is shown in the lower left there. Just it's phenomenal. If you've seen the 100-foot wave on HBO, I'm not promoting it. I'm just because I shouldn't do that as a federal employee. Actually, my personal hat is on right now. So, but it's amazing. Like the waves are just incredibly insane. Yeah, the 100-foot wave. It's a really so why are these waves doing what they do near these canyons? And if you focus in on that middle picture, that's black. So you're looking towards La Jolla Point there and on the south side. And what's really interesting, if you look at that big mound of water, that wave about to come in and break, you can see how it's kind of oddly shaped. And what's happening there is the canyon is actually taking the wave field, and just like at Mavericks and other breaks where waves are refracted and focused, the canyon is focusing the waves in on that point. And so people know that at Nazare and Blacks and some of the other canyons that exist that come up the continental shelf, that you can have that focusing effect because of the deep water. And if you turn to the next slide, this has actually been the focus of some really interesting studies like the Nearshore Canyon experiment, which was a bunch of oceanographers a little over a decade ago came together and said, let's try to understand how waves are really transforming up these canyons and why are canyons making these big waves. And I think you can see there on the bottom, that's a GIF that was produced from some numerical modeling that came out of a lot of the observations of that work. And you can see how those red colors are where waves are peaking up and becoming very large. And what's interesting, it's always on that north side of the canyon. Right in front of the canyon, you'll see there's a little note there that says low waves. The waves are not really peaking up in front of the canyon. It's on that north side. And what's happening, it's sort of like the canyon is acting like half a point, right? And so the waves are refracting around the northern wall and coming into that Blacks area and really making those big waves that are sort of crossed up just a little bit on the canyon side. So canyons are really, really cool. Not only are they just fantastic conduits of sediment and turbidity currents and of course sediments to the deep sea, but very interesting things are going on there with waves, especially on these active margins. Yeah, we'll go to the next one.
I'm going to interrupt you again because there's another fault moment. This is the Rose
Oh,
Canyon
good.
fault.
Yes.
The Rose Canyon fault wraps around, and La Jolla is a little pop-up pressure ridge, and the Rose Canyon fault essentially goes down the axis of the La Jolla Canyon, and this is the Scripps Canyon here that points at Blacks.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, another fault
Oh,
moment.
no. And, yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. More geology is good. And I think there's one more that I'll cover really quickly. And some of the more famous breaks in California tend to be at river mouths. And we see this not only in California, but all over the world. You go down to Mexico, Central America, South America. There's a lot of these, especially along these active margins. We see at the mouths of creeks and rivers, these points where waves will move down the point. I talked about that a little bit earlier at Rincon. The classic example in California is Malibu, where we have this input of sediment coming from upstream. Now that comes in all kinds of forms. It might be delivered during floods. It might be delivered during debris flows. Some of these really large debris flows and there's all kinds of other things going on, slumps and such in these sites. But just wanted to point out that these places have these active supplies of sediment, and sometimes boulders are bulldozed into this by nature through debris flows, like we saw in Santa Barbara in 2018 with all those debris flows. If you go to the next slide, this is just a classic picture. Not enough geologists do this anymore, but actually make hand-drawn. This is one of my favorites, showing. This is actually showing the Eastern Santa Barbara Channel in Moore's report, but just kind of showing that on these active margins we have a lot of transfer of sediment, and those inputs of sediment can be really important in terms of making surf breaks at some of these creek mouths. And what's really neat is they change. If you get a big input of sediment, you might have a certain type of a break for a while, and then as the waves rework it, it may change with time. So another way that things are dynamic here on active margins. And I think that's the last of our examples, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Cool.
Thank you both very much. We'll come back to you guys in just for one final slide, but in the meantime, wanted to direct people back to the Menti. We've got one more question related to this webinar about now that we've gone through all this, how are you going to approach the waves if you're interested in trying surfing maybe for the first time, or this is getting you out there more. So I'm going to wait to share those results until John and Amanda have a chance to do their last slide, because then I've got one more Menti for you. All right. Okay, go for it.
Oh, Amanda, you're on pause, or you're muted.
Great. I was having a great conversation with myself. Yeah, so our last slide was, well, if you're so inspired after this, how do you get involved if you want to get involved? And so we just wanted to give folks some ideas about, if you're so inspired to get involved, how you might get about it. So, the first thing, especially if you don't have experience and you want to get involved, is to get some instruction. And there's so many ways to do that these days. There's any place you go where there is surf, there will be a surf school if you want to go get hands-on instruction. And these can be formal, organized schools where they've got all the equipment. There can be individuals you can hear about, from your local surf shop, whatever. But you can go get some instruction through a school. There's a lot of good online videos, and I know my husband, who's been amazing at trying to get me and my kids to all have better pop-ups, which we may have a demo of later. That's a part of like how you get up to your board when you're surfing. It's called a pop-up, but there are a lot of things you can see online. And there's one thing I wanted to mention too, is just there's some instruction that's probably important to have about etiquette. There really is quite an etiquette around surfing, right? And there's behaviors that are expected, not only around pecking order of like who's in the water, but also just for safety, right? So for example, whoever's furthest, to where the wave is breaking tends to have, priority. You wouldn't take off if you're down the wave of someone who's already on the wave and get in their way, because it's dangerous and it's going to piss them off. So there are some things about etiquette that is really important to learn, whether that's go have a chat with, your buddies that surf at the surf shop, or go online and look a little bit. I'm sure there's plenty of forums talking about that, but etiquette's important, right? Just for your enjoyment and for everyone else's. And then we were talking a little bit about, okay, well, where do you go, right? So there's local surf organizations, pretty much most spots where there's rideable surf, there's a surf organization. Surfrider is a more, national organization that they tend to have, branches at most surf spots. So Surfrider is a great spot to reach out to and find out what's going on in your local area. Local surf shops, we have a couple here in Houston that are great, and generally we'll have good information. Of course, we'll also have equipment. They can guide you to what kind of equipment to get. And then, for better or for worse, there are websites and cameras, right? So websites that can tell you what's going on with the wind, websites that can, of course, you can always go get the tides. You want to know the wind, you want to know the tides once you understand the spot. And then cameras where you can even look and see. I will say, with the caveat, cameras are great, but they don't tell you everything, nor do the predictions, because where we surf here in Texas, and it was funny, I was watching a blog about this, or whatever it is, a video blog. But in the GOM, those, like Surfline, for example, is a fairly famous website that forecasts surf. They can never get the Gulf of Mexico right, because the wind is totally unpredictable. What's going to come out of it? It doesn't fit their algorithms. So unless you have a little bit of knowledge and what happens with the wind and what's going on with the tide, to the extent that the tide affects it, you will not get something out of that forecast. Equipment. We're talking a little bit about equipment, and equipment is varied, and it's really badly varied based on your experience as a surfer, and also the break that you're going to go surf, right? And personal preference, right? There's long boarding, which is a, particular style and a particular kind of wave. There's short boardings, performance boards, fun shapes, whatever. I think what I say for folks who are new and want to get started, your best bet is either go rent a board from your, local or surf shop, or, these what they call soft top boards have come out in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, and they're incredibly economic. You can go buy one at Costco for $100. They have, like, they're called as a soft top. They have a soft foam top, which means that, it's not going to get impaled on your body if you're lucky. They're a little bit, safer for those who don't have as much maybe control over their boards. So that's a good option. You can rent and buy, go buy a soft top, or like I said, go rent. Depending on where you're surfing, you may want a wetsuit. The Gulf of Mexico is interesting. When I moved here from California, 20 some odd years ago, I actually left my wetsuit with a girlfriend in California because she needed one. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to the Gulf of Mexico. It's going to be warm. Well, the Gulf of Mexico is a fascinating spectrum because it'll be near 80 in the summer, and in the course of 3 weeks, it'll go down into the 50s. In fact, I've surfed out there when it's 50 degrees, where it's way colder than California, or even getting, on par with the North Sea, and I can't feel my feet for an hour on the drive home. So you may need a wetsuit depending on where you're going to surf. And actually, this picture up here, just to because I need to point it out. That's my youngest son, and he wasn't 5, he was 4, surfing in the Gulf of Mexico, and I think it was springtime. So he's on his little soft top, and he's got his little, what we call a spring suit, which is a little wetsuit that only goes down to your thighs and, down your arms, so you're not too hot. But, this is the kind of equipment you might be getting after. And then finally, I am absolutely vigilant about sun protection. I and my kids, put your hat on, wear your rash guard or your sun shirt, and put on the SPF, because, if you're going to really be spending time out there, you got to protect your skin, and you actually, it protects your eyes as well. You can get damage from the reflection, on your eyes and whatnot. So just some ideas of, how you could get involved if you're so inclined. And, those would be my suggestions on if you wanted to get out there and get going. Jonathan, do you have anything you would add to that?
Well, I saw in the chat, I'll stick to kayaking, and I want to encourage that. I mean, there are definitely different ways to enjoy the ocean and different modes. And so surfing may not be your thing for a whole host of reasons. I love to body surf. It's swimming basically, and you can do it in waves that generally people don't like to surf in, and so I'm usually lonely when I body surf. Yeah, boogie boards too. Exactly, Allison.
Absolutely.
I had more fun with my kids with boogie boards when they were little than probably anything. And just like that kid on the bottom right, and there's a whole host of ways to enjoy. And so finding that where you're comfortable, where it makes sense. I always encourage folks, if you go to Hawaii, get there are locals who have these outrigger canoes, and they'll take groups out and they'll surf wave. Do that. You will have the ride of your life. It is amazing to ride a wave in an outrigger canoe with locals who know what they're doing, or something like that. I mean, there is a whole host of ways to enjoy the coast, the ocean. I know folks who surf ski or kayak downwind and just.
Hey, John, we need you a little bit closer.
Yeah, sorry.
No.
Lean in, John. That folks who love to surf ski and kayak downwind runs, and so they'll jump in the ocean in one place and leave a car down coast and just ride that wind swell that Amanda was talking about, and that can be a super fun. I for a couple of years I paddled 6-person outrigger canoes, and we would do what we call downhill runs, which are basically downwind runs. There's nothing like riding waves in those canoes. It's just a hoot. So there's if a surfboard doesn't feel right, there's a whole host of different ways to enjoy the ocean, and we always need the people on the beach watching and enjoying it, and handing us our towel when we get in and giving us a hug. So that's always a good place to be too.
Well, and all the things you guys have talked about are totally applicable to, stand-up paddleboarding, to kayaking, to, windsurfing, to kiteboarding. There's all kinds of, what's the word? Similar but related, or different but related ways to enjoy the water. So,
Yeah.
all right, I'm going to go to our last. Oh, first of all, I wanted to. Oh, I think we have some.
Just some
No,
pretty pictures.
yeah, some pretty pictures. And then this isn't totally our end because this is the end of the prepared content, but we wanted to move over to Q&A. So, Dan, I think there were a couple of questions if you want to.
Yeah, thank you. We do have one question from Don who asks, how does Nelscott Reef compare to Mavericks in terms of bathymetry, if you know it, and Nelscott big wave only recently discovered due to being a bit offshore?
Right. So Nelscott is up in Oregon, and it is one of those big waves. Now, it being so far up north, it's exposed to slightly different swell. And yet, from what I know, it breaks off pretty far offshore. I have not seen any bathymetric maps of the region. And in California, the state and a bunch of other groups like the U.S. Geological Survey got together and mapped a lot of the continental shelf. I don't know of similar maps that get into that region. I may be wrong, but I was just quickly searching for some, and I have not seen them. I would love to see one if anyone has that, but I have not seen one for Nelscott Reef. Often when we take these maps, we collect the data with acoustic sensors like multi-beam sonars, and they always blow my mind. I always just love looking at those maps. They just have so much information. So I have not seen one for Nelscott Reef, and I haven't studied that region either. So I may just not know of it and might exist. So.
Well, thank you, Don, for taking the time to send in your question. We are open for others as well.
Yeah, were there any in the chat, or if anybody wants to ask something either in the Q&A or in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, we can even unmute you if you want to ask it live. Okay. I don't see anything coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and do some concluding slides. And then if anybody wants to hang out for another 5-10 minutes after this, if something comes to you, then we'll still be around. So first of all, I wanted to thank our awesome panelists for their presentation. Super informative, super engaging, super pretty pictures. I like the image heavy, text light slide deck. Also, thank you to our sponsoring organizations, AAPG Women's Network, AAPG Lone Star, and especially Midwest Geosciences for preparing our cool commemorative swag. And then our awesome Geology Up volunteers. I already named them at the top, and thanks for your help now and always. And thank you to everyone for attending. I was watching the attendee list. We're down to 80 now, but we were up to about 150 earlier. So that's awesome. And also looks like from all over the world.